Yeah, it's 5 past. I think we should start. Welcome everybody to our second last seminar in Digital and Public Humanities, organized by the Venice Centre for Digital and Public Humanities at Foscari University. This seminar, as all other seminars, is going to be recorded, and recording is already ongoing. So please be aware that you will be recorded if you, what we hope, will be participating in the discussion after the presentation from Marilena, who I will introduce to you now very shortly. Practical, so we have room for discussion after the presentation, which will be around 40 minutes. You please use the chat to share references, URLs, questions. So we will have an open discussion for everyone to ask questions in all directions. You can use the chat or just raise your hand, and I then can give you the word here in this round. So this is an open discussion, I hope, after the presentation. I think that's about it. So thank you again to Stefano Dallaglio, who organized this series, and Elena Alessandra Vivan, who is doing all the backlogs or the logistics behind the scenes. So thank you to both of you. Marilena Daquino is assistant professor at the University of Bologna. She is a member of DARC, so all friends from the Digital Humanities Advanced Research Center of the University of Bologna. She holds a PhD in library and information science and computer science, and her research focuses on the application of semantic web technologies to humanities research data, with an emphasis on archival and museum data for art history, especially photo archives. And she will talk to us now about semantic web and authoritative humanities data. Marilena, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Really happy to see there are many people. Let me share my screen.
I will put myself on mute, and
just tell me if you see.
Yeah, that's it's
okay. So
yeah, that's a presentation. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Let me try to minimize you, because otherwise I see everybody on the right side. Okay, so let's start. The idea of the talk today was to give you some insights of the research that I am personally carrying on at the University of Bologna, but there is a quite broad research group that is behind the topics that I am going to present. And of course, you will find also things that have been done by interesting research groups that are also outside the talk. So I will try to merge everything, what we do, what we reuse from other interesting research, and I will also show you at the very end some future research lines that we are currently working on. In particular, today, I would like to start from some theoretical aspects, that is hermeneutics, and to move then to what is the definition of digital hermeneutics, which is the field, let's say, which is the category of keyword that we can use to categorize this kind of research that we are going to see. In particular, today, I would like to focus on one specific aspect of digital hermeneutics, that is how to represent knowledge, in particular with relevance to the semantic web information, and to see what are the problems, okay, in this context, what we are working on and so on. And I will also mention at the end some projects that you may want to have a look at. So first, let's start with the basics. I don't think I have to tell to many of the people that are in this room what is hermeneutics in general. let's say, what is the motivation of this research? So we all start working on our sources by close reading our texts. And usually what we do in computer science would be called knowledge extraction. That can be manual, it can be automatic or semi-automatic. But the idea is that when we read a text, we are looking for some clues, and we want to do something with these clues, usually to create new knowledge. So this knowledge that we extract will be part of our epistemological process for producing new information. And how do we produce this information is usually by formulating some hypotheses that make use of the clues that we found in our sources, but it also includes some background knowledge that we have. So we have some assumptions that we don't need to demonstrate, that we give for granted. We have some facts that have already been demonstrated by others. And then we have a new hypothesis, something that we need to demonstrate. And by demonstrating that, we usually compare what we have done with what others have done. Okay, so we compare our approach to the approach of somebody else. Okay. So what happens usually in the humanities, rather than in other, let's say, hard science, is that the methodology that we use for performing this task is not always reproducible, or not all the aspects that are part of this pipeline, let's say, of this workflow, can be properly described and formalized, meaning according to every discipline, and then specific cases inside a certain discipline or specific research areas in a discipline, then we look for different clues, because different clues have different relevance to our problem, so to our future hypotheses. And the way we select these clues is usually very different. So we decide something is more important than another thing in different ways. In some cases, groups of clues, let's call them clusters of clues, are necessary and sufficient to validate our hypothesis, but in some other, this is not the case. Then we may want to make use of logical processes that can be like inference, or induction, deduction in particular. And we don't really know how to describe for all the types of problems that we have, if there is a match, like a pairing between the type of clues that we are looking in the text and a logical process that you can associate to that clue. And then there are many other aspects that are not reproducible. So these are just a bunch of examples. So for example, the background knowledge that we have, how would you formalize it? Like if you have to create a data set or some other digital format of this kind of information that you need in order to validate an hypothesis, how do you do it? Like the background knowledge changes according to the scholar, of course, that approaches the text, but also changes according to the discipline, the research area, and the specific topic. So it's not something that can be given for granted at the beginning. So all of these aspects that cannot be formalized allow us to say, okay, then the methodologies in the humanities are not always reproducible. And then comes the question, is this methodology valid? So usually what we do is, since there is this lack of agreement on what is a methodology and how to reproduce a methodology, we use authoritativeness as a scapegoat, let's say, or as a common sense way to justify our decisions and to validate our hypotheses. Meaning, we look at the authoritativeness of primary sources. Are these primary sources peer-reviewed articles? Are sources provided by authoritative authors, meaning in case of academy, like how we look at the affiliation, we look at the position of the person. We also may want to look at the number of citations. This, of course, applies for living people. But when we look for classical text or historical text, there are other ways that affect the authoritativeness. And then something that we always do is to look at the secondary source, meaning who publishes, who may be publishing this information that acts as an intermediary. So for instance, the publisher, if this article is published in this journal that is issued by this publisher, we may trust the publisher, okay, rather than the author if we don't know much about the author. So we make these kind of inferences. And that's the thing. So we kind of create a chain of trust, okay? We are able to inherit, to let inherit this authoritativeness between the three parts that we have mentioned, meaning the author of a source, the source itself, and in case if there is a secondary source. So for instance, if the author is deemed authoritative, then the sources produced by this person are deemed authoritative. This is very likely to be the case in the humanities. Imagine like in art history, an art historian that makes, for example, artwork attributions is deemed authoritative. If so, all the attributions made by these historians tend to be considered correct or at least authoritative, even if they are not true. Likewise, if a source is authoritative, then the secondary sources, so who publishes this information, he inherits the authoritativeness, no? So it's like when a publisher gains popularity, or in the case of the humanities, can be a cultural heritage institution that decides to publish this information. Imagine a photo archive, okay, or in my case, you will hear a lot about art historical photo archives that publish information about artwork attributions made by art historians. So for instance, at the University of Bologna, we have a long-run collaboration with the Federico Zeri Foundation. The Federico Zeri Foundation has the catalog of the archive of Federico Zeri, who was indeed notable art historians of the last century. They publish the cataloging data of the photographs and the documentation included in their archives, and they include the information on the attributions made by him. So in this sense, the Zeri Foundation has some authority, and vice versa, Federico Zeri has some level of authority, and they influence each other. What is important is that, for example, the Federico Zeri Foundation doesn't publish only artwork attributions made by Federico Zeri, but publish attributions made also by other art historians, by auction firms, and so on. To that extent, knowing that a renowned cultural institution publishes information from other people allows you to infer that from the secondary source, so from the Zeri Foundation, you can let inherit the authoritativeness that the Federico Zeri Foundation has also on the auction firms or the other historians that are mentioned and cited by the Federico Zeri Foundation. In the literature, these two aspects, so the auction firm and the Federico Zeri Foundation, let's say, that publishes attributions made by an auction, are called respectively first-hand knowledge providers, so say those who made the attribution, and second-hand knowledge providers. And this is a very peculiar aspect in the humanities because it happens a lot. So we trust data that come from cultural institutions rather than self-published information by historians. Now, how a machine can make sense of this load of information that we just talked about? So there is a lot that is going on. So there are several disciplines that are trying to make sense of this information. And the obstacle, the barrier that all the disciplines have is that this information about how you argument, how you describe the way you reached a certain thesis, it's not available in data. Or if it is provided in shallow forms. So data are not structured. So it's really difficult to work with common technologies on these aspects. Moreover, when cultural institutions, for example, provide this data, and so assuming that we trust cultural institutions, when they do it with different granularities. So some cultural institutions may care a lot about publishing, motivation, sources, anything that can help a reader to validate some statement, some claim. So for instance, the artwork attribution. And while some others, they don't, because possibly that's not the mission of the institution, or this data is not available, or it's too much burden to produce data on purpose just to justify. Point is that currently in the humanities, when we produce digital objects, there is no way to enforce scholars to provide data on the argumentations. So everything is given for granted. So when we publish, I don't know, for example, let's take another example. We publish a digital edition of a text and we provide a reading of that text. Despite most scholars tend to provide information that justify their readings, in a digital edition, we don't have a mechanism that enforces this. So it's up to the authoritativeness gained by the scholar to let the user trust the information that you are providing. And in particular, this is the problem, the trust. So there is no way to enforce mechanisms, but there is no agreement on what makes data trusty. And here it comes the topic of the day, that is digital hermeneutics. So what is digital hermeneutics? If you look around in the literature, there are two definitions of digital hermeneutics. The first one concerns more on basically developing the awareness of scholars in using digital sources in research inquiries, meaning I want to use a YouTube video. How do I trust this YouTube video? How do I trust the author? How do I trust that this source would be there in 10 years? Okay, and this is one field of digital hermeneutics. The second one, that is the one that I care most, is building methods that support the user in the decision-making process. So you have some data that you are not sure about the trustworthiness, that you are not sure about the authoritativeness. You want some methods that help you to classify basically the sources that you are going to work on as trusty or not. And in particular, I work in a specific field of computer science that is dedicated to the usage of semantic web technologies. And this talk will be about one of the problems that there are in digital hermeneutics and semantic web, that is the knowledge representation problem. In particular, there is a lot of work that has been done in the semantic web community on how to represent and reason over trusty information. So how do I represent? What do I need in order to represent information that can be deemed trusted? And how do I reason on this type of information? One specific aspect that, of course, it's a recurring aspect in this research is the research on provenance of information. So who did what, when, and possibly why and how, considering the limitations that I already said before. So there is no method to enforce, but there is also not an agreement on what makes data trusty, especially if we dive into disciplinary data and we dive into humanities data. Indeed, what is good in general, so the standards that have been created that look at the provenance of information that might be eligible for being used in any discipline, they don't cover all the aspects that are peculiar of humanities. And there is one aspect that is particularly overlooked, that is, okay, we trust cultural heritage institutions. So we trust that the data that they provide are somehow true and not only trusty, true. But what happens in reality is that cultural institutions may provide contradictory information about the same objects. And at that point, how do you choose which one is the most trusty? They are both deemed trusty, but who is trustier than others? To explain what is the problem of semantic web and how to represent trust and authoritativeness in semantic web, I want to start from the basics, just to be sure that everybody can follow, because I don't know your backgrounds. So in semantic web, every statement, every claim, every piece of information can be represented as a triple, okay, where we have a subject, a predicate, and an object, like in natural language, more or less. So imagine we have an artwork that is called the Three Graces. You can see an example here. And we want to state in our data that this artwork was made by this artist called Peruzzi Baldassarre. This is the building block of semantic web. So every piece of information is organized in triples, meaning that a subject or an object of the triple can be in turn subject and object of other triples. So for instance, we have a subject that can have several predicates, okay, like this artwork was created by Peruzzi Baldassarre and it's depicted in a certain picture, like this one. And this picture, so what was an object of a triple becomes a subject of another, this picture is preserved at the Federico Zeri Foundation. Sometimes describing information in a triple fashion is not enough. So we need to find another way to make statements about statements. So imagine we have the case where we want to say, okay, the artwork is created by Peruzzi Baldassarre is a statement that is supported by the Zeri Foundation, okay? Without diving into the detail, there are several proposals for doing this in semantic web. You may have heard about reification, singleton properties. You might have heard about RDF star and so on. These are all standards or almost standards, let's say, for representing this type of information that go beyond the triple fashion. So here we have a triple, but we have a fourth element. Okay, so this triple is transformed in something else so that it can be a new subject of another triple. So this will be the subject and all the statement will become the object. And there are several ways indeed for doing this. Some of the ways, I will go through some of the ways, but as I said, without diving into the details, is, okay, we want to represent that information, but we want to keep using the triple fashion because it's more convenient, because there is a lot of technological support for using this type of information organized in this way. Imagine it's the same as saying, I want to use CSV data, like tabular data, because there are a lot of tools that allow me, for example, to do visualizations with this data, because they allow me to make formulas like, I don't know, Excel or Google spreadsheets and so on. And the same works with semantic web data. So we want to keep it simple. Then what you would do in this case is to create new entities, new subjects, okay, that allow you to group this information. So for example, we can create a new object that describes an attribution and a specific attribution, so the one that we are talking about. And then we can link this information to who said it, about what, and what is being linked to, okay? And possibly we can add the information about the motivation. So for instance, in this case, the attribution of the artwork to the historian was made because on the back of this photograph, there was written by hand by Federico Zeri that this was his attribution. So we have an evidence that Federico Zeri said that. Sometimes people decide to change approach. So this approach that I just showed you, it's what is called an ontology-dependent approach, meaning, this approach requires you to define new terms, okay? And the terms that you may want to use, for example, to call attribution, somebody else from another institution, from another country, from another culture might not agree with that, okay? With this way to call the information and with this way to organize knowledge, because we need to remember them all. something that we don't remember most of the time is that these kind of representations are cultural biased. So we decide to represent an attribution as something that is composed by an author, a subject, an object, and possibly a motivation. A way to represent this information without relying so much and so strictly on the vocabulary that we use for the predicates, for example, for the classes, is to use graphs. So what are graphs? As you may know, the basic of semantic web is that triples create sets of triples. Sets of triples can be grouped in graphs. Okay. At this point, when we need to add information about complex information, and we need to top up this complex information with as well other complex information, we may want to divide this information that we have, this graph, in what is called, let's say, subgraphs. Okay, so I have a bucket where I include all the information about the attribution. So for example, the artwork has been created by Peruzzi Baldassarre, is being created in a certain place, is being created in a certain date, and so on. We put it in a bucket. And then we put in another bucket all the information about who said this and why and how. These two buckets are what are called name graphs. And name graphs can be linked with each other. So we may want to decide indeed to have a graph that includes information about an assertion, so something that is questionable. And then we may want to have a graph that includes all the information that you need to validate this thesis. And then we can create links, exactly as we did before, like creating links between entities. We can create links between graphs. So in this case, we have a bucket, we have a second bucket, and we say that the second bucket supports the information in the first bucket. Going back to the approaches. So these are the main two approaches that at the moment exist to represent questionable statements and the arguments supporting or contradicting a statement. So we have ontologies and we have name graphs. Specifically, when we look at the ontologies, we have a few golden standards that we can use. So one is the example that I showed you before. So we create an entity that represents an attribution. This attribution is connected to all the elements and blah, blah, blah. And if I have a second attribution that contradicts this one, I will have a second entity that connects the same artwork to another person and not to Peruzzi Baldassarre. So I kind of duplicate data and I divide the differences. One of the golden standards for doing this job is CEDOC-CRM. That is indeed one of the most used data models for representing knowledge, in particular in museums, but they are widely used in many other, by many other types of cultural institutions, including archives, for example, and photo archives. Point is that ontologies, as they are, they do not allow to represent all the aspects that you would need for automatically evaluate the arguments supporting, for example, an attribution, or when I say attribution, I mean any hypothesis or any questionable statement. In particular, CEDOC has some limitation that is, to the best of my knowledge, at least, it's not so easy to specify relations between an attribution and the sources. Okay, attribution and statement to me are interchangeable here. So between statement and sources. So you want to say that for this attribution, I use the photograph as an evidence or as a source of information or some other reason. Okay. Unfortunately, CEDOC allows you to say, okay, there is a motivation. And then it's up to you to describe or to understand when you interpret the data that photograph or a more complex pattern for describe that the photo was used as an evidence is the case. Then there is no way to represent a link between the statements, so the attribution, and the background knowledge. So this thing happened in the history, so there was this cultural phenomena that I need to take into account, phenomenon that I need to take into account in my attribution, because otherwise who reads the data cannot understand why I'm claiming something, okay? So you need to understand that it has to be this particular artist, because the way the artwork is depicted respects the canon of a certain style, or a certain style in a certain place, or a canon in a certain style, place, and date. So you narrow all the information, and basically you narrow down to the author. How do you represent this information in a structured way? It's not that easy. And unfortunately, CEDOC doesn't allow you to do it. CEDOC, but of course, many other models. And then there are other problems, like you cannot have detailed information on the relation between claims and people. So for example, I want to say, I make this attribution on the 3 graces made by Peruzzi Baldassare because Federico Zeri says it. So you can't express this information. So you can't express that you are relying implicitly on the authoritativeness of a person in order to say that your claim is good. Likewise, you cannot express the methods that you use, because regardless, these are not reproducible most of the time. This can be classified. So you can say that this attribution has been motivated because I did some stylistic analysis on the picture or on the artwork, or because I retrieved some information that was signed on the back of a photo. Or why is important? Because sometimes you may also retrieve information on the back of the photo that is anonymous. So would you trust more an anonymous information on the back of a photograph, or assigned information by an art historian, and so on? So you may even want to think of rankings of reliability of these methods, as well as criteria. So for example, how do I measure the authoritativeness of Federico Zeri or anybody else? Of course, according to the discipline, there are several ways to measure authoritativeness or an approximation of authoritativeness. Typical example is the number of citations for an author in academy. So you use the number of citations to understand if the person is trusty and trusted by others. And most of all, in CEDOC, there is no way to represent relations between statements, so especially between competing statements and statements that are not just easily classifiable as positive or negative, like agreement and disagreement. Another important standard that is already in place and that helps to overcome some of the limits that I've already presented is the provenance ontology. That is a W3C standard, and it allows you exactly to represent with a small but quite powerful pattern most of the information that you need in order to describe the workflow behind an interpretation or an attribution. So we can describe this process as an activity that is performed by an actor that produces an entity, in our case, for example, an interpretation or an attribution, and so on. This activity might be informed by another activity that was done by somebody else, or it can use some sources, or it can use some other person actually somehow. And these sources can be attributed to people. Still, again, there are few drawbacks. So here as well, it's not easy to understand and to properly qualify the relations between statements like agreement, disagreement, and so on, and the relations between statements and sources, like I said before, evidences and sources of information, which are very important for describing the argumentation around an hypothesis. And this is a small model that we have developed in Bologna a few years ago that tries to cope with some of the problems that have been described before. In particular, this model, it's mapped, so it's aligned, terminologically speaking, to both of the two models before. So it's aligned to CEDOC CRM and it's aligned to the provenance ontology, and it allows you to describe the workflow of an interpretation or attribution as being asserted in some source, of being of some type, or using some criteria, citing. And when I put cites is actually a keyword that includes a long list of possible properties and relations for describing what is being cited, whether it is a person or a source, like a material source and so on. And all of these things can be linked to a statement, which is in turn potentially linkable to another statement. So another claim by another person, either in agreement or in disagreement. What is interesting possibly to notice is that when you study this thing, how to represent this kind of information, you discover that there are patterns. Okay, so there are building blocks that you always need to take into account when describing hermeneutical aspects or epistemological aspects. And this can be summarized in three main groups. One is the assertion. So what is questionable? What is the subject? Okay, or what is your final claim? So for example, in our case, in the running example, the Three Graces is an artwork made by Peruzzi Baldassarre. Then you have the provenance that we said, who did what, who said it, how, when, and why. So the attribution is made by Federico Zeri, who wrote the claim on the back of a photo. And then you have a second level of responsibility that is usually your second-hand knowledge provider, that is the one, remember we are talking about a formal representation of data. So he's the one that extracted this information, for example, from the back of a photograph, and it's creating the data to represent this information. So saying the claim, Federico Zeri claimed that the Three Graces is an artwork of Baldassarre Peruzzi is a claim that has been in turn made by the Federico Zeri Foundation. So this third layer is the layer of the second-hand knowledge provider. And what is interesting is that in a discipline that is completely far from the humanities, which are biomedical science, they invented a model to represent this pattern. And this model, this data model, is called nanopublication, that allows you to represent this bunch of information that we mentioned, okay, that here are just represented by a label, but you substitute the label with a bunch of triples, okay, so with a bunch of assertions and statements in RDF, and you get the graphs. So basically, they designed a data model to organize graphs and to link graphs. In particular, a nanopublication is usually a piece of information that has been extracted from an online source, like an academic article, where you have a statement, okay, and all the information about the statement are represented in this graph. Then you have information about who said it, okay, so the author of the article and the context in which it's been said, and then who extracted this information. Why is this so important? Because this level is again another level that allows you to understand the trustworthiness of this data. Because I make an example. If a human reads a paper and creates data about what is written in the paper, it's possibly more reliable, of course, less and less over the time, than a machine extracting automatically this assertion, because you might be extracting something wrong. You might misinterpret something. You might misinterpret the argumentation. You might misinterpret the topic, and so on. So this level allows you to specify how data have been extracted, who is publishing them, when and why, and sorry, when and how. We're going towards the end of the presentation, where I want you to highlight some new research line that we are following in Bologna. That is, starting from the two representation ways we have discussed, so ontology-based or graph-based, one thing that has been overlooked by all the standards so far in semantic web is about the actual assertion of the statements that are included in graphs. What does it mean? So the statements that we include in our graphs are asserted and are meant to be considered as true. What does it mean? A machine may interpret this information that we see here in two ways. So we have a statement that says the artwork Free Graces is made by Baldassarre Peruzzi. Then we have a competing information, okay, provided by an auction firm, for example, that says, no, this artwork was made by this other person, okay? When we include these two triples in our data set, and we parse this information, the machine can understand only two things. That is, either Peruzzi Baldassarre and Bernardino Luini collaborated in making this artwork, or Peruzzi Baldassarre and Luini Bernardino are the same person. These are the only two ways that a machine interprets this knowledge. It's up to a person to say, no, this is not possible. It must be one or the other, either or. The user can do that, okay, but not the machine. And most strategies that we have seen so far do not make explicit that this is not possible, okay? So they leave up to the interpretation of the user, the meaning of the data. What we are trying to do is to find a meaningful way, and we have, that is to explain that what is asserted, that is expressed, sorry, in a graph might not be asserted. For instance, all the community agrees that this artwork was made by Peruzzi Baldassarre. This was a not trusted attribution. So we can claim that this is not an actual claim anymore, okay? Rather than expressing this information with ontologies, what we can do is to tweak the definition of graphs and create conjectures, okay? Conjectures are basically graphs in which we don't specify that the information included in the graph is asserted. And there are a couple of escamotages for doing this. One is to use singleton properties, that is different predicates, okay, for each of the competing predicates, meaning we have seen so far that we use the same predicate to say it was created by, okay? What we are doing here is to say, okay, let's say that this artwork, maybe it was created by Peruzzi Baldassarre, and maybe it was created by Luini Bernardino, okay? So we are not using the same one. And the second thing that we do, it's to basically, I want to simplify it, is to flag, so to add a label to these graphs, saying this graph doesn't include asserted information, but is a conjecture, okay? So that we make explicit to a machine this label in particular that we top up, with which we top up the graphs, makes explicit to a machine that what is inside there must not be considered true. And to wrap up, what I wanted to highlight today is the state of the art. So far we can use ontologies to describe hermeneutics-related aspects. We may want to use graphs to top up these representations so that we can give them a pattern fashion, so that everybody describes the hermeneutical aspects, at least in the macro level, in the same way. And then we can try to explain the machine using some, I don't want to minimize like schematics, but like by tweaking the semantics of graphs to explain the machine that the knowledge that is included in our data, it's not certain. What is missing in this presentation that would require another presentation is, okay, once we have represented, once we have agreed on how to represent this kind of knowledge, assuming that we find an agreement, it's okay, but now what do we measure? How do we measure it? And this is something that is really discipline dependent. What we have been working on in Bologna is how to measure this information in a few areas. In particular, one work is focused on the running example that I showed you during the presentation, that is Mouth, that is an ontology-based recommender system of artwork attributions. And basically this recommender takes information, crawls information from several photo archives, art historical photo archives like the Federico Zeri Foundation, and for artworks that for which are provided contradictory attributions, it goes into the analysis of the arguments that are provided by the photo archives to justify the claim. And then it provides basically a ranking of these attributions and shows in the interface all the information that you need in order to make your decision. A second project that I would like to highlight, it's Meatload, that again is, the topic is more or less the same, is a catalog that includes all the literary sources that have been used by artists. And these literary sources and the contents of the literary sources are linked to the contents of the artworks of these artists, in particular with a focus on mythological subjects. And the last one is, if you are interested, there is an introductory paper that I link here, is in this concept of the conjecture, so on how to express uncertain information in the semantic web without actually asserting, so letting the machine understand that this knowledge, it's not certain. Thank you. I think I am done. I also put a few references. I can share the link to the presentation with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Marilena. That was a fantastic introduction, overview, and perspective of further research that needs to be done to guide us into the semantic web. I think we're at a very important time in the development here. So this is an interdisciplinary seminar, and we can ask all the questions that we want to ask as regards basic understanding. So nobody should embarrass just because he or she is from a neighboring field or from a specific discipline. So we can clarify basic questions, and of course questions that are going beyond this. That goes without saying. So you can leave a note in the chat. I can read it, or I can ask you to read it then yourself. You can raise your hand. I see already Elena Spadini raised her hand, and yeah, or you just shout if you feel like you are overseen from me. So Elena, yeah, you have to whisper probably. Can you speak, Elena?
Yes. Sorry, I was trying also to turn on the video, but I cannot.
Okay.
I don't know why, but you can hear me now. Yes. Thank you, Marilena. That was it was brilliant as always and very clear. I was just curious about, for example, what kind of arguments you use in the first of the three projects that you mentioned at the end, and how you formalize these arguments. Because yes, I am not very familiar with this domain, with this field, but yes, to try to imagine how can you apply this to other fields, it would be I think helpful to have some example of these arguments. I don't know if it's clear.
Yes. Thank you for the question. So, in case of photo archives, of course, I based the formalization of the arguments on the actual data that they have. Meaning, in photo archives, it's a very nice place where to look for this information because they provide very well structured data on this. For instance, for every attribution, they have broad but controlled vocabulary to explain the motivation. So we motivate this attribution because of bibliography, and then there is the list of the bibliography references that they use. Or we motivate it based on the last attribution made by the Christie's auction firm in 1928 and so on. And the nice thing is that they also provide the discarded attributions. So the work consisted in looking on what the Zeri Foundation, for example, had, or other institutions like the Villa Berenson Library in Florence and the Frick-Art Reference Library in New York that had kind of the same information. And they shared pictures of the same artwork, so it was easy to look. And to see how the ways they describe the arguments differ. So one is the motivation. Sometimes the motivations can be distinguished with the criteria. So we did statistic analysis, or we used, we just looked at the back of the photograph, as I said. Then the other way is mentioning one person, saying this thing was said by Bernard Berenson, or by Federico Zeri, and maybe there is a date. Of course, this claim, it's not written anywhere. Okay, so you have a first level of inference saying, okay, this thing has been said to the catalogers of the Zeri Foundation, but it's not written in any bibliographic reference. So they didn't publish this information, okay? And all of this information allows you to build a chain of trust or untrust. So if it's in a bibliographic reference, you are likely to trust it more than something that is written on the back of a photograph or something that is authored by this person, but we have no idea of what, of where this statement is written, okay? And then you create this system of ranking. And this is one thing, and it's for the sources. The other thing is the people. So once you have two attributions, competing attributions that are both based on the same criteria, what do you look at? You need to look at the context. So am I looking at old bibliography or recent bibliography? More or less? So are there 10 bibliographic references that support one attribution against two, but the two ones are not but, and the two ones are also old. So which one would you like to trust more? And then you look at the authors of these attributions. And of course, we are talking about historians that are not on Google Scholar. So you can't go there and look for the citations that they have. So you need to implement some measures, and you need to do it across systems. So for example, let's see how many times Federico Zeri is cited by these photo archives, and how many times is cited for as an accepted attribution, okay? Because it can be mentioned only in the discard, also in the discarded ones. So this is, for example, the case of Bernard Berenson, because he worked much earlier than him. And of course, most of his attributions now have been replaced, okay? And then you may want to look also at the reliability of this person in the specific context, meaning Federico Zeri made a lot of attributions on Michelangelo, okay? You look across all the sources and you are evaluating in that specific moment an attribution of another work that has been attributed to Michelangelo. Okay, let's go and look in all the sources that I have. If people usually accept Zeri's attributions about Michelangelo, if so, then your authoritativeness grows. Of course, this works when you have people like Federico Zeri that made attribution about everything, also this bottle, probably, okay? And you have a lot of data to quantify this thing. And it's good because you have also historical data supporting it. I don't know, I think it was quite detailed. Is it okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Olaf Berg, you have a question. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, something with the automatic of the computer didn't work. My question is regarding to your proposal for conjectures as extensions of a graph. And if I understand right, your proposal is in the very moment you produce an assertion, you can decide I flag it as conjecture to another assertion. So I wonder how you manage when you pull together different assertions from different sources. And that's the main idea of semantic web. That's not one monolithic producer of information. How you decide to flag, because in your example, I think both institutions at the time they make the assertion, they are sure it's an assertion, not a conjecture. So my feeling is that your idea by flagging these assertions, you can make the conjectures machine readable. It doesn't work because the machine, there's still a human who has to decide when pulling together those different informations. Oh, this is a conjecture, or this is only a supplemental information about what you said, no? About maybe it's another producer as well, or it's the same person with different names. So I'm not convinced that by flagging you can really make this decision machine processable.
Okay, thank you. I agree with you. So there is a lot of subjectivity in this. It doesn't have to be the data provider that flags this information. I mean, I may want to decide to use, for example, the information from the Zeri Foundation, from Berenson Library, or somebody else, and I decide to flag this information as conjectures, okay? And you can decide the heuristic for doing that. For example, somebody may want to use, I don't know, if you're familiar with argumentation mining, you may want to use the Tolmin schema to say, okay, if this information is not backed up by some other information, and if it doesn't contradict other information and it wins against another argumentation, then you have a fact, you have an assertion and not just a conjecture, because it's something that is asserted and argumented and motivated. You may want to use that as an heuristic. You may want to say, if the data is not complete, then you have your heuristic for creating conjectures. It doesn't have to be the provider doing this. To my point, I might decide to process somebody else's data and to transform them so that I use this representation. The idea would be that, yes, anything that can be deemed questionable, it's already there. For anything that you have to provide a motivation is potentially a conjecture, right? So for the same reason, people start using more and more other standards for describing these pieces of information. Like in TI, you have a module for describing the motivations of a certain reading on a text, and CEDOC CRM, somebody actually has been writing CRM inf, okay, for describing this information. This tells you what are the type of information that are already potential conjecture. So even though the data provider will not change the data at the origin, but we can use it for reasoning on this information in some other way. So we transform it in on the fly, let's say. I don't know if it's convincing.
He has to think about it, I think. Yeah. Okay. There is a comment from Etienne Posthumus that is especially interesting with regard to iconography. I mean, if you want to elaborate on this, Etienne, that's very, very welcome. So we're interested in iconography, of course. Otherwise, next question would be from Paolo Monella. Where are you?
I'm here.
There you go.
First off, I'm very convinced about what you're saying. I think this is a particularly fascinating topic, especially today, because I think that, okay, let's imagine, okay, well, my first thought is that at some point you can move, my cats are fighting.
Are you sure these are cats?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, better. Anyway, okay, at some point, a human will have to make the decision of who is trustworthy, I think, nonetheless. Why? Let's make this example. You're just moving it one level forward. And I think we agree on this. And this is particularly important in this moment in our society. Example, vaccines are useful. Paolo says that vaccines are useful. Or BioBlue, oh, well, Rai 1, well, the Corriere della Sera says vaccini are useful. And someone else says Corriere della Sera is trustworthy. And BioBlue says vaccines are not useful. And someone says that BioBlue is trustworthy, okay? What's happening today in our society is that the sources of informations and opinions are not shared. The authoritativeness of the Corriere della Sera is shared by 80% of the population, but 16% or more of the population think that Corriere della Sera is in some sort of global plot. And BioBlue, who's this alternative journalism thing, is the only trustworthy one. And there's no point in telling someone, Corriere della Sera reported those numbers, because for some people, this means that this is authoritative. For other people, this means obviously they are servant of the big pharma. So this looks like a topic that only applies to humanities because we are blah, 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 and we only make conjectures, but it increasingly happens that in hard sciences and even life sciences, some issues, some sources of information that we used to consider authoritative in a shared manner are no longer considered authoritative in a shared manner. I think this is a cultural and political problem that will become more and more important. So I think the question is, how do you escape this kind of, if you do escape, and I think that we agree that you cannot escape, that infinite loop of Paolo says that, Marilena says that this is authoritative.
Well, I don't know, I don't think you escape. So to narrow down a bit what I think you can do with these methods for classifying is exactly like are the typical tasks. You can classify information as being authoritative or not, okay? And you arrive at a certain extent of this chain, of course. You need to make some simplification, and then you can recommend. These are the two tasks that you can do. Of course, you will never replace the interpretation of the person at the end. And of course, you need to do it in an ethical way so that you never replace the other person. So when you recommend, you should also provide the counter examples and so on. But no, I don't think it's something that we can do automatically.
Yes, I agree. But yes, I mean, it's very interesting. And I think that these kind of topics will become more and more central in our societies.
Oh, they are already. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Etienne agrees that there's no ultimate truth, but we have a question from Alexander Huber. So Alexander, if you want to pose your question yourself, otherwise I can also read it. Are you there?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just curious because as CEDOC CRM has obviously been mentioned, and so I was just wondering if the presenter could say a few words about CEDOC CRM and kind of why it doesn't do what we want it to do and what it would need to make it do what we need it to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I considered it. I've heard that I think it's still in draft. Is it correct? I don't remember. I don't think it's.
Yeah, I mean it's been around for 6 or 7 years, but it's. I was just curious because it offers an ontological approach, which doesn't require a technological approach. Like you mentioned RDF star and stuff like that. I mean, you can stay completely within the traditional triples with it. So I was just wondered if you had any thoughts about it.
Okay. Yeah, no. Of course it works. And it works as an ontology approach. It works perfect. Nothing to say about CRM. What I wanted to point out is that today there is CRM inf, and then I made my ontology. So I am guilty as well. And somebody else might want to use some other ontologies and so on. So this is an issue that everybody tries to cope with, an ontology. But why? I mean, possibly there are other ways that are not ontology dependent to represent the same information across all the data sources. And that's why we were pushing on these other direction. Like we cannot make everybody agree on which model to use. So we cannot ask a machine to learn all the possible ontologies for representing these things. Let's figure out a way that allows us to represent uncertainty in a more shareable way. But no issue with CRM in general.
There are 2 references from Emmanuel Norman. Do you want to say something about this, maybe?
Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
It's just because it was mentioned, these nano publications, I would provide those links, and about the technical approaches, how to reify or make statements about statements. Where also mentions the name graph, the RDF star, and the singleton and reification. And I think in this links, it's very well described there, just to put a note there. But as soon as I'm now here, I can ask a question too.
Yeah, please.
I'm rather coming from computer science and formal methods, to be more precise. And my question was whether this idea of conjectures would be a change also to the underlying framework of RDF or the logics, or would this be going too far? I mean, no. Your notion of uncertainty is, as far as I understand, it's not about fuzziness in the sense of fuzzy logic or so. No. It's more that you say it's rather about belief, say that, like that.
No, thanks for the question. No, it's not about changing the logic. It's more like a sugar syntactic change in order to distinguish the information that you are using, you are reproducing somehow in the dataset, but it's not an actual fact. It's not an actual assertion. So, yeah, no change to the logic, no changes to the semantics, let's say, to that aspect, but finding a way that allows us to express these semantics with minimum change in the standard. That's it.
I mean, in the end, you make statements about statements, and the statements are just objects as any other object is can be an object, a physical object. Now, in your case or in our case, it is a statement, and you make statements about statements, and you want to model chains of trustworthiness. And for that, in the end, you also develop a kind of ontology or a model.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. I'm not making statement of statements.
Statements about statements.
Yes.
Yeah. And so your objects are now the statements themselves, like
the graphs.
The graph or the graph. So the graph itself is an object you make. Statements about a graph. So the graph becomes an object or an entity by itself.
The graph is an entity by itself.
Yeah, because you refer to the graph and say about the graph that this, for instance, you said this sentence or this attribution made by someone, in my opinion, it's reliable. So you can express that somehow.
So, no, okay. So all this information is part of a graph. Then you flag the graph as not being asserted. So you are not responsible for that information. That information is there in your data set. I don't want to say accidentally, but it's there, but you don't want it to be interpreted, okay, along with similar information that can be contradictory. Like the example I showed you, like this artwork is made by this artist, and then you have the information, no, but this artwork is made by this other artist. How do you reason on this information? And the limitations that I said were those two. So either the two artists are the same person, or they collaborated, right? This is how you would parse normally this information. If you flag this information as being conjectures, then you're able to say, okay, either or, these two things are in alternative, okay? And none of them is asserted for real. So I don't have to infer that the two artists might be the same. I don't know if it helps with the... Okay, good, thanks.
Thanks for the reference, Alexander, to the CDOC CRM. And Stefano reminds us that this discussion, and including the chat, if we manage, will be published on YouTube, so you can get back to these points here. More questions from the audience. So I don't know. My background is as a textual scholar, and I grew up with, no, I didn't grow up, but I got more adult with TEI. And I mean, there you have the options with responsibility statements, responsibility attributes, and you can give degrees of certainty, high, medium, or whatever, or percentage. Does this in some way relate to or is an alternative way to express and make these attributions processable, or are these really disconnected worlds? So that's what I wonder myself.
Those would be treated as statements, like the level of certainty, for example, or things like that. No, that would be, in this idea of conjectures, they should be described as normal statements, because you are asserting that you are not certain of these attributions, let's say. So that is an actual statement, is an actual claim that you are making. The point is still the same, is the group of statements that you are making that is not certain, and that you don't want a machine to reason on as it was a fact. So yeah, it would be a plain triple, let's say,
yeah,
in your graphs.
Yeah.
Okay.
More questions? I think you had a long day, Marilena, and we all are very happy. So that was really very, very informative and interesting. So if there are no further questions, I think we have to let you go. And
thank you again.
Thank you once again. And yeah, so our next seminar will be in 2 weeks, on the 5th of December. We have Arturo Gallia from Università Roma 3, and he will talk about historical cartography and public history. So everyone welcome to attend also this seminar with a very different focus. Information will be shared through all our channels, and yeah, lots of other events upcoming. Thank you very much, Marilena. Thank you all the attendants and everyone who was involved and engaged in the discussion. So there's a lot of work to do, I feel. And yeah, everyone have a great evening. Yeah, usually, I can't say usually because the pandemic is so long. So before the pandemic, the first series, we always had a aperitivo in presence, but so that's.
I'm going.
Yeah, you're going.
You should all go.
Yeah, please do. And yeah, if you come next time to Venice, just let us know, and then we will have one. Yeah. Okay.
Talk to you soon. Have a good evening.
Thank you very
everybody.
much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.